if you look at the bottom of page 7, Kant begins to give examples of duties, and they're actually quite helpful because they help to fill in what the heck he's getting at. And I think that they're quite helpful because they really show you what kind of moral philosopher Kant actually is. He discusses happiness above, and he recognizes that all human beings want to be happy, that it's absolutely natural to us, just as Aristotle said, that we seek our own happiness. But for Kant, that cannot be the foundation of morality, because happiness is what fulfills our desires. And what fulfills our desires is set by our desires. So that what would be good for us would be relative to our desires. And that would mean that morality was just a matter of getting the things that you happen to want because you happen to have the desires that you do. And he doesn't think that that's really what morality is about. He thinks that most of us realize, and I'm just saying this is his position, that morality is about doing the right thing, not about doing the thing that necessarily makes you happy. We all want to be happy. But Kant would say we all recognize that we have a duty to do things sometimes that don't add to our happiness, that positively may make us unhappy. It's sort of built into our thinking that there are actually things that are more important than happiness, both our own happiness and the happiness of others. Sometimes we realize we have a duty to do things that make others unhappy. It's just the way it is. And if we follow those intuitions, Kant would say, then we have to admit that happiness is not the most important thing. What's the most important thing? Doing the right thing, or what he calls duty. So he gives a couple examples of what it means to act out of duty. The first one, at the bottom of page 7, he says, a man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels wearied of life, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. Like somebody who is so beaten down, been so crushed by life, is asking, is it contrary to my duty to myself to commit suicide because I don't want to live anymore? Now he inquires whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. That's the idea we were introduced to in the first readings. His maxim would be, or is, from self-love I adopted as a principle to shorten my life when its longer duration is likely to bring more evil than satisfaction. So the maxim would be, whenever you feel like your future would bring you more suffering than enjoyment, it's okay to commit suicide. That would be the maxim. It is asked then simply whether this principle, founded on self-love, can become a universal law of nature. That is, could you actually will this to be a law for everyone? Kant continues at the very bottom here and says, now we see at once that a system of nature, which it should be a law, now we see at once that a system of nature, of which it should be a law to destroy life by means of the very feeling whose special nature it is to impel to the improvement of life, would contradict itself, and therefore not exist as a system of nature. Hence, that maxim cannot possibly exist as a universal law of nature, and consequently would be wholly inconsistent with the supreme principle of all duty. That, I would say it's a little confused there, his argument, or it comes off as confused, but you can see what he's getting at. He's saying that that maxim would contradict itself, that the maxim that it's okay for a natural creature to end its life prematurely when it sees a bleak future would contradict the very notion of nature promoting life. Something like that. I mean, but you see what he's getting at, is that a person who had been so beaten down by life and had such a bleak future to look forward to, Kant says, couldn't commit suicide because that would be contrary to their duty to themselves. So they continue to live out of a sense of duty. And guess what? We know people like that, right? We know people like that who continue in life out of a sense of duty, of either to themselves or to others. But it's not so far-fetched, I think, actually, Kant's example, however depressing it may be. And here's a second example, which has to do not with duty to yourself, but duty to others. Number 2, another finds himself forced by necessity to borrow money. He knows that he will not be able to repay it, but sees also that nothing will be lent to him unless he promises stoutly to repay it in a definite time. He desires to make this promise, but he has still so much conscience as to ask himself, is it not unlawful and inconsistent with duty to get out of a difficulty in this way? Suppose, however, that he resolves to do so, then the maxim of his action would be expressed thus: when I think myself in want of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know that I never can do so. Now the question is, can that maxim be universalized? Now, this principle of self-love or of one's own advantage may perhaps be consistent with my whole future welfare. That is, lying, if you're good at it, can help you. But this is not the question. Some people are good liars, and their lies bring them good things, I guess. Money, fame, love of others. No names will be mentioned, but you know who I mean. But the question is not about whether your lie will actually benefit you in some way. The question is whether you can ethically lie and deceive. Now, this principle of self-love or one's own advantage may perhaps be consistent with my whole future welfare. But the question now is it right? See, that's what some people don't ask themselves, right? Is it right? They only ask themselves the practical question, what will it get me? What are the risks? They don't ask themselves the moral question, is it right? And Kant, if you know him by now, thinks that's the only relevant question here, right? I change then the suggestion of self-love into a universal law and state the question thus: how would it be if my maxim were a universal law? Then I see at once that it could never hold as a universal law of nature, but would necessarily contradict itself. I'm about right here. For supposing it to be a universal law, that everyone, when he thinks himself in a difficulty, should be able to promise whatever he pleases, with the purpose of not keeping his promise, the promise itself would become impossible, as well as the end that one might have in view in it, since no one would consider that anything was promised to him, but would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. That is, I ask myself whether it's in a state of duress, whether it's ethically permissible for me to lie, to say achieve a loan, to get a loan. Well, if I apply the first version of the categorical imperative, which is that everything that I do should be capable of being an example for everyone, or my maxim of action, my rule of action, should be capable of serving as a universal law, Kant says I instantly see that I can't do this ethically. Because if everyone were to act like I am acting right now, that is to make a lying promise, that would just cancel out the whole idea of promises if everyone were to do that, because no one would trust anybody's promise. It would be like a joke, as it is among some people, right, who have repeatedly made broken promises. Their promise becomes a joke. If everyone acted that way, there would be no promising at all. It wouldn't be part of human behavior because no one would take it seriously when someone made a promise. You would just laugh. So I realized that I can't make my maxim of action a universal law, so I can't do the thing ethically. I want to say right now, I can do it, and people do lie, right? And even if I go through this process of thinking it through the way that Kant has, I could still do it. This man could still make a lying promise to get a loan, but he would know that he's acting immorally. That is, the categorical imperative or the clarification of our duties doesn't mean that we will act morally. It just clarifies to us what the reality is. We can't let ourselves off the hook. We can't pretend, I had no choice. I had to do it. No, you did it out of your own self-interest, knowing that it was wrong. And we've all done such things. I've done such things throughout my life. Every human being has. It's called being flawed. But what Kant won't let us do is be hypocrites about it. Listen, you did something wrong because your maxim of action could never have been universalized. So you did something wrong. Every human being does. So Kant's moral philosophy doesn't teach you or doesn't make you a good person. No moral philosophy does. Kant's moral philosophy is meant to allow you to clarify for yourself what your duties are, what your obligations are, what your moral obligations are, and then as human beings we have to negotiate them, and sometimes we're moral and sometimes we aren't.